to the cloud. Okay. And there's no stopping anybody to get on here. So just you'll keep hearing that, dinging, sorry.
But they
So-
don't need to. But they don't need to be let in. They'll just automatically come in. Okay,
No, because they only have the link if they got the invite. So anyway, so I wanted to welcome everybody and thank you for joining us on a very beautiful Thursday afternoon. This is our last and final faculty development workshop, and we are spending it with Dr. Michael Wiederman. So, and Dr. Wiederman has been providing many different workshops for us. We called this the Leadership Series, as you are looking at the screen in front of you. And today is the last one about, difficult conversations, which we are looking forward to. So without further ado, Michael Wiederman.
Thank you. So again, if folks have any questions or lingering whatever's the observations about these previous topics, do tuck that away and bring that up later as well. I would always like to loop back. But of course, just like everything, I always like to sort of plant the seed about maybe the quiz, unofficial quiz at the end, is what did you take away or what do you plan to do differently after this? So just sort of have your radar up for maybe being able to volunteer your answer to, what was most valuable or what you most plan to do after this. And so this topic about conscious communication, difficult conversations, that kind of thing, it's really a blend of these three books. I wish I could take credit, but these are three of my favorites. And so this is sort of an amalgamation of them. And I'll be sending out the slides, and so you'll have reference to these if you want to come back. Notice that first one, Nonviolent Communication. It's a great book, a terrible title, because it sat on my shelf for a long time before I finally looked at it, because I thought, well, I don't engage in violent communication. What does that have to do? But you'll see that it's sold over 1 million copies. It spurred an institute, and they have trainers that, blah, blah, blah. So it really is a good program. But I guess I wish that they would have, chosen a different title. Where we go, there we go. So the premise of that first book that I just mentioned starts with asking us, why do we communicate? And it seems like such a simple answer. Rosenberg has one answer that and captures it all in his mind. And so I'm just curious, take a stab at what you think. Why do we communicate? Oh, and by the way, remember that little photo there of the raised hands means that the question isn't a rhetorical one. I just, if you see that, then I'm saying just chime in, unmute yourself. Not a right or wrong answer.
I mean, first thing that comes to mind is communicating is to be social.
Oh yeah, for connections
that we can do, connections that we have with other people.
Absolutely. So like I say, relationships, connections, we're social creatures, so we need to communicate for that. Absolutely. That often comes up. Anybody else? Many times folks say to communicate information, right? We need to do something, work on something, whatever, right? So there's like 2 or 3 that tend to come up, including the social stuff, the connections, the information. He boils it down to say that all communication is to meet needs, which, is overarching with what we just said, right? So there's somebody's needs that are potentially trying to be met, either ours or theirs, or both of ours or somebody's. And so ever since I've encountered that concept, I've tried to pay attention to, has there been an instance in my experience where communication isn't ultimately about some needs? And I've yet to find one, so maybe he's onto something. But with that, he then unspins like, well, why is it that we don't seem to be very good at getting our needs met through communication? So whenever we talk about communication problems, communication breakdown, ultimately he would say there's, needs were not being met, and that's what really people are talking about. But why aren't we necessarily very good at getting those needs met? He says, well, let's go back to our childhood socialization, right? Like, what is it that we learned as kids without explicit teaching about communication? One is that we're rarely taught to identify our needs, especially maybe in Western cultures, right? It's not good to be needy. And so you're supposed to be independent and self-reliant and self-sufficient. So if communication is about meeting needs, maybe part of the problem is we're not very good at being socialized to recognize our needs or admit them to ourselves or to others. And then this one is really pernicious. We are taught that others cause our feelings. And just imagine all of the thousands of times you've heard statements like this up to this point. I was angry because he blah, blah, blah. She disappointed me. You make me so happy. You made me, right? It's all these kinds of statements definitely imply that my feeling is a result of your behavior, right? Either what you did or didn't do, or whatever the case might be. So let's keep that in mind, that idea that we're taught that other people cause our feelings. Now, this probably looks familiar because it comes up in virtually everything that I do. So I know we've shown it before, but that's another way of saying what I just said in the previous slide, that we experience our feelings as the direct result of something happening, right? Somebody did something or something happened out in the world. But of course, psychologists point out that this is the much more accurate version, that everything that happens in interactions with people are filtered through our story, our creation, our interpretation, perceptions, and so forth to create those feelings. And that story is influenced by so many things. And I've really highlighted here assumptions. So again, you've seen these slides, but this time I put assumptions in red to really emphasize that that's part of maybe why the communication breaks down, right? So again, when we experience feelings, we assume that other people are causing them or circumstances are causing them, and that's based on lots of assumptions. So where are we going with that? What do you see? I was curious. What is this a picture of? No guesses? What do you see?
I see a guy typing, texting, not socializing, and the girl's asleep on the bike. It's Naisha.
Yeah. So you see a girl asleep on the bike or unconscious or whatever, right? A woman. Yeah. But look very closely. Is that a woman?
Oh, no, it's not.
Yeah, but I saw the same thing, right? And I think most people do it first. And you have to really study to realize, no, it's his legs, but we put that interpretation, right? So just a funny example of how we as meaning makers, right, humans automatically make sense of our world and make conclusions, draw conclusions. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that sometimes they're not accurate. So what is happening here? It's an undoctored photo.
The lioness is carrying her cub.
Carrying her cub and hoping that it doesn't look like, I mean, how's the cub breathing?
Oh.
Well, because it's this, right? But we saw it from the other angle. So you're absolutely right. And it's normal, but from that angle, it looks like devouring the head, right? Or the head is up in the mouth. So again, it's all about perspective and so forth. One more. Is this, I'm not familiar with the royals. Is this Prince William or Henry?
That's great.
But what do you think is happening? What's your interpretation?
He's talking to his dad. No.
Talking to his dad. Dad.
He's Prince William.
That's Prince William, yeah. But maybe when I first saw this, I thought, oh, he looks like he's getting into a car. Maybe he's got into an altercation with the press, right? And that kind of thing. But it turns out from a different angle, he's talking about three things. And it's, obviously the same shot, just a different angle. So again, it's all relative. So, and this happened to me, or happens to me quite frequently. So I'm curious what your interpretation is. You are texting someone that you don't know well, and you've not met outside of texting. The exchange has been occurring at a fairly brisk pace. You make a statement meant to be funny. The other person does not respond, and the conversation seems to cease. It's now been 15 minutes since you sent that. What happened? This happens to me, like I say, more than I like to, whether it's email or text or whatever.
Naisha, they misinterpreted what you said, probably.
Could be that even though I meant to be funny, they took it seriously and maybe a little bit offended or a little bit put off.
That's what I was going to say. They were offended by what you said.
Yeah.
You thought it was funny, but they didn't.
Right. And I've definitely gotten into trouble in that realm. And that's my immediate assumption. Anybody else? Any other interpretations? Are there other possibilities?
Sure, like maybe they couldn't get back to you and
Yeah,
something
yeah.
came up and they weren't able to. And then they'll email or text you back and say, oh, sorry, I was caught up with something while you're fretting that you offended them.
Exactly. You just described my life. So as you say, in the interim, I'm assuming, oh my gosh, I offended them. Should I send an apology? Should I not?
Right.
Whatever. And then eventually 9 times out of 10, there is some other explanation, right? And you say, yeah, absolutely. So again, a great example about how we create these stories, right? And if we don't get counter information or check them out, many times it just feels like they were accurate, right? So so what's the risk with these assumptions? Well, they often lead to our actions, right? And so then we try to compensate, or we try to respond in kind, or we try to, then that furthers our assumptions about that person and about our relationship and so forth. So again, lots of potential risks. So again, we're trying to tie all this together when we assume that our feelings are caused by other people's actions, right, rather than our interpretations. And our stories have some of these assumptions in them, either based on our past or based on our recent experience. Then what happens is when we have a negative emotion, we tend to externalize that onto the other person as a judgment. Right? Because if I'm feeling negatively and I'm assuming that people cause my, feelings, then there must be a problem with them, right? There must be an issue with them that is causing my feelings. So when we feel negatively, Rosenberg would say it's because our needs are unmet. But instead of recognizing that, we tend to externalize that negative feeling as judgments, right? So we say things or hear things like they're lazy, or they have it out for me, or they're disrespectful, or they get on my nerves. And people say these things about us. We may or may not hear it, right? But when the communication with us is, not meeting their needs, then the same thing happens. So if it's really about unmet needs, then what could be, there's no right or wrong answer, an unmet need behind somebody saying, well, they're lazy. What is it that person's, what need might they have that is not being met?
That they didn't do the work or something?
So the other person didn't do something that I think they should have done or that I need them to do, right? Do people agree? Does that sound more accurate? But if I
too much work. I feel like
So-
I'm doing too much work.
Right. So I feel like I'm doing too much work. It's unfair, right? I'm doing more than they are, that they need to, pull their weight. They need to do more and so forth. So it really, though, is about me having a need for them to do something differently, right? Around their work or whatever. So, but notice if I phrase it that way, it feels vulnerable to me to say, I need them to work harder, or I need somebody to help me, or I need, to feel like there's a fair distribution of work. That's probably more accurate, but I just don't hear people usually phrase it that way, right? Instead, I think they phrase it like, well, she needs to, or he needs to, or they're lazy, or whatever the case may be. So what about another example from the previous slide? They have it out for me. So what's the unmet need?
Maybe they're not understanding or listening to me.
So I don't feel understood, right? I don't feel like they're supporting me. So the need, I guess, like I say, I need to be understood. I need to be supported. I need to feel like I'm being heard. And so when they don't have that need met, it's projected as, again, well, they're, disrespectful. They have it out for me. This last one, they get on my nerves. What's the unmet need? They get on my
They're not doing what I want them to do.
They're not doing what I want them to do, or they're doing something I don't want them to do, right? They're making a noise. They're talking in a certain way. They're, whatever. So there's just so many that fit under this one, right? This is like the blanket one about they're doing something that I don't like, or they're not doing something that I want them to do, right? They get on my nerves. But again,
Well, can't that, I'm sorry for interrupting, but can't
Yeah.
that be also a guilty conscience too with some people? Like they might feel guilty of lacking something. So this is why they say that.
So I'm thinking like in the Freudian sense, it's like a projection, right, of their own. So can you elaborate a little bit more? Like what's maybe an example?
Trying to think. Like if a person was given a task, like a couple of tasks to do, and they didn't do the task. Instead of taking the blame on themselves, they redirected blame to other people instead, not taking accountability.
Oh, that's, like I said, I think that's huge. And it's not even just projection. I think that's like you say, protecting my own sense of ego or whatever. It's not my fault that this didn't get done, right? Well, she should have done this, or, she didn't send me that until it was so we project the blame, absolutely, whenever we're feeling like we're lacking in something, or, that people might make negative judgments about us, that we're not meeting their needs, that we're letting them down. Absolutely. So we can see what we get from that, right? Protection from feeling like we are the problem, or we can be attacked, or, our own ego and so forth. So if step one is to effective communication is identifying our needs, well, then maybe our feelings can be a cue to those needs, right? But we have to separate them from our stories and our judgments, because we're going to immediately, make the judgments based on our stories. So I'm just curious if you can recall an occasion where you made a negative judgment about somebody. I know you probably never do. I never do either. But it could be something small, could be something big, could be today, could have been from last year. And so just try to call up an example where you made some negative judgment along the lines that we've made. Is there anybody who's willing to share, keep it generic, just so we can sort of use that as an example?
That just made me laugh. I mean, I never do this, but I'm just going to do a scenario.
A hypothetical, a friend of mine.
A friend of mine. Anyway, I had a student worker, and she wasn't, or I thought she wasn't doing anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm texting my coworker and be like, what the heck is she doing? Like, let's get rid of her. I don't think she's doing what we need her to, and blah, blah, blah. And then my coworker said, you need to go talk to her. I'm like, all right. So I went to talk to her, and then I was like, oh, whoa, I way overthought that. And she was doing what we were asking. She was just doing it not the way that I would have done it. So I felt very guilty after that.
And how did that conversation go in terms of, like, how did you even learn that information that she was doing?
Because I just approached her. I said, can you just explain to me like what you're doing? Because I had a different vision of what how you had to tackle this. So she just went through the procedure of saying, well, this is how I'm doing. I'm like, okay, well, that makes sense. But, and then I gave her suggestions on whatever. So then I felt really bad for saying what I did.
Sure. No, boy, you're again explaining my experience or describing someone's experience all the time, right? Absolutely. And other folks, can they resonate with that or something similar?
I'm Chandana. Sorry, I don't have my camera on. I'm having a lunch at the same time.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're not looking into just the adults, I think this occasion probably happens every other day with my daughter, and myself, and bringing about a teacher that she did this, she said this. But then you're like, at that time as a mom, you're like, oh, that's sad. That's, but actually when you look at the actual scenario, it's not how it is supposed to be coming from the teacher point of view.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what I hear you say is that if we sometimes step out of our usual role with that person and just played the idea of like, what if I was, just whatever, the teacher of this person, not the parent, or if I was just an observer, and that I would make different interpretations, right? But, or have different feelings. But like I say, there's that meaning that we ascribe to it when, based on our relationship and based on our unmet needs. And I have a need for my kids to look a certain way, act a certain way, but I don't care about other people's kids, right? So if she were somebody else's child, I wouldn't, be making those judgments. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, it'll be nice to step out of those shoes and then interpret to see where they're coming from. So yeah.
Well, I think that, and I don't mean to take this as a tangent, but I think those are the relationships where when kids become adults, they're successful is when parents are able to somewhat let go of that relationship as parent-child and treat them more like, an adult or, a related friend or those kinds of things. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I teach a medical student course, and so this would have been Tuesday night, and somebody shared an example. I forget even why it came up, but he said that, he's on his third year, so he's in clinical rotations. And so he's in a clinic, and he said this just happened since last time we met. He said that he was on his computer, his laptop outside of a patient room, doing quiz questions. And eventually, the preceptor, the physician, came out of the room or whatever. And thank goodness the preceptor at some point said, "Hey, are you really interested in like learning and, in this rotation?" He's like, "Well, of course I am. Why is he say that?" "Because I've seen you on your computer sometimes, and you're not really paying attention." And he said, "Oh, no, I was waiting for you to, blah, blah, blah. And I need, just to be efficient with my time. So as long as I'm just gonna be standing in the hall, I figured I'd do some quiz questions." But she had constructed the story that he really didn't even want to engage. He's just trying to stay on his computer. And he's thinking, well, I'm waiting for her. And she said, well, I was actually waiting for you to get off the computer so that we might, talk about the case and whatever. So, thank goodness she brought it up and clarified it. But what if she wouldn't? Then she would have had that negative feeling and made a judgment about him. And then he would have thought, well, she doesn't really care about, my education. It could have been a very, negative experience. So lots of good examples. Absolutely. So what was the unmet need? So I'm guessing, like for Joanne, that the unmet need was, I need to see some results, or that this is getting done, right? Or because it doesn't sound like there was apparent that this was getting done. I know, Joanne, I
Or
know
not
had
done
has to
fast
leave.
enough.
Oh, okay, not done fast enough. So I haven't seen, the progress. Absolutely, yeah. So then imagine if we're talking about conscious communication and trying to get the needs met. Well, anyway, we'll get there in terms of like, then how might we have approached it a little differently? So that's where we're going next. How can we increase the likelihood of getting our needs met if communication is about my needs? So obviously, trying to identify and acknowledge the underlying need first, and then making a clear request to really try to get at that need. So what do you think of these examples? I need you to pull your own weight, or I'd appreciate it if you'd show me more respect. So those are both cases where the person is asking for something, right? They hopefully have identified the need. What do you think about the clarity of those requests?
I like them.
You like them? So imagine somebody came to you and said, I need you to pull your own weight. Would that be enough for you to be able to say, oh, thank you, yes, I will start doing that right away?
No, actually, how would you like me to do that?
I'm sorry?
No, I'd actually ask a question.
Oh, yeah. So then you'd have to ask questions, right? Or if somebody came to us and said, I'd appreciate if you showed me more respect, I would immediately think, what are you talking about? I don't think I'm disrespectful. I've never, and so, yeah. Other folks, what do you think?
I think it's, I think with those kind of negative responses, you're going to get negative actions and responses right back.
Good point.
I don't think it enables positive behavior.
These are both very negative judgments, aren't they? They're almost like calling people names, right? Almost like saying, I need you to quit being lazy. I need you to quit being disrespectful, right? Absolutely, yeah. It's going to put people on the defensive. But even if you said, even if you just really, truly wanted to get better, you wanted to meet this person's needs, I feel like these don't really tell me what to do, because I can't imagine that I see myself as not pulling my own weight, or that I don't see myself as being respectful, right? So I'm going to be left with, lots of questions. So even though it may seem on the surface like, well, this is a step in the right direction, right? It's not specific enough in my mind to really result, plus the negativity, as we say. And this whole process has made me very sensitive to when I hear other people say, well, you need to blah, 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 blah. And I bristle when I hear that now, because I think to myself, well, no, technically that's not true. If I really believed that I needed to do something, I'd be doing it. So when you say to me, you need to do something, really, I think what I hear now is you, the other person, has a need for me to do something, but they're not admitting that, right? They're saying, well, you need to. So I don't know, am I making too big of a deal of that? Have you heard people say to you, you need to?
I think I statements are definitely more helpful because it feels less accusatory to the other person, even if it's something good that you're trying to say. Like sometimes I'm an academic coach, and when I meet with students, we often come up with like very tailored academic plans or academic recovery if they're falling behind. And so sometimes even in the most positive way, I'll say, okay, here's what you need to do. And I even in those moments try to rephrase it, because I don't want it to sound like I'm forcing them to do something. It
Yeah.
really, what I mean to say is, here's what I suggest, or here's what I
Yes.
recommend.
Yeah,
Same thing
yeah.
with feelings. If you can say, instead of saying you made me feel this way, you could say, I felt this way when you said or did this. So
Absolutely.
that way, because it's also harder to dispute that. How can someone
Yes.
say that you did or didn't create some sort of feeling within, no one can really
Yeah.
dispute my feelings except me. So
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
it kind of alleviates any sort of blame or attack.
No, that's perfect. Like you say, that those I statements, as you said, all you can speak to is your own experience. And when you do that, like you say, it's impeachable in the sense that people can't argue and say, well, they'll try to say, well, you shouldn't have felt that way. You say,
Sure.
but I did, right? But like I say, as soon as you say, you made me
Yes.
feel, well, that implies an intention, right? That they wanted to, or intended to, or had, and there is more room, I think, for them to then get defensive and say, well, that's not what I meant, or, whatever. So absolutely, it's all about I statements. But boy, it's really tough. I mean, I'm still working on trying to, condition myself to, but I have incorporated this idea of my story, and I tend to use that a lot. And I'll try to say, well, my story is this. And it's just a reminder to myself and to the other person that this is my interpretation, but I'm not saying it's the truth. I'm not saying it's the only, way to look at it. Anybody else, your reactions to any of this thus far?
I think just in general, like people, just what this whole workshop is on is like, you feel uncomfortable telling people exactly what you are feeling or needing. And how do you say it in such a way where it's not going to turn into an altercation?
Mm-hmm. So I hear two things in there. Like one is that it sounds like it's very vulnerable to be this way, right? To say, I feel this way, I have this need. It's really, making ourselves vulnerable. And it feels like there's a risk, not only in being disappointed, but again, like you say, needing to be careful, because we could be stepping into a landmine or pushing a button that could create some conflict or, animosity. Absolutely.
And I think personally, as human beings, we are not built up to take criticism positively.
Absolutely. Right. It's about our ego. It's about,
Yeah.
And I say ego not in the sense of feeling puffed up, but we all have an ego in the sense of a self-image, right? And like you say, anything that runs counter to our self-image is going to be uncomfortable. It's an attack. And so we are going to get that fight or flight response. Anything else? Where are we going with this? So in the example that you had or formed in your own head about making a negative judgment about somebody, what was the unmet need and how could you have made a more clear request? And so it sounds like with Joanne's example, she went and checked it out and said, hey, help me understand. And then there was the resolution. And so it's very difficult, I think, up front to know that I need to see in this example, I need to see certain progress by certain time to feel like this is happening, right? And so, because I think we just take for granted that, well, of course I'm going to see that. Of course that person's going to get started on it right away, or they're going to, tackle it from this perspective. So again, I'm just realizing as I'm talking this out that many times it requires a lot of insight into what do I foresee needing, as opposed to assuming, and then when those needs aren't met or it doesn't look like they're being met, then I, have a negative reaction.
Well, I have a comment because I think because of everything that happened with the pandemic, some people are still like set. So it's like you're trying to, there was like secondary trauma and all these students, students or faculty or people have lost people too during this whole pandemic thing. So it's like, it makes it challenging to communicate clearly with people because you're like, I got to figure out a way to tiptoe around this and cater to this or that. I don't know. It might be just me speaking that way, but that's the way I feel. Like it's changed. The whole dynamic of communication has changed. And now that we're starting to open back up, then it's like, you got to get people used to communicating effectively.
No, I agree entirely. And a couple of examples that came to mind was reading this blurb about how, and I forget where it was, but the schools, it was a different country, but the schools had not been in session for the past, like you say, 18 months, 2 years, whatever, and they were finally back in session, and the teenage harassment of the boys, sexual harassment of the girls was just off the charts. And I attribute that to, as you said, 2 years of not being socialized and not being around each other. And, and so it's almost like we have to relearn some of that stuff. Or another example was that there's a cancer institute here in Alabama that hired me recently to come do this kind of work with their middle managers, because they said everybody is just stressed and afraid and burned out. And, usually the managers would be the ones to help, smooth communication, and they're having difficulty communicating, and everybody else. And so, like I say, just a lot of frayed edges right now, and frayed, emotions, making communication even more difficult.
And what about just the topic of people don't know how to communicate because they don't talk to each other anymore? They're on their phones and they're texting or emailing, and they don't do it face to face anymore.
No, absolutely. And, there's all this stuff in the business literature about if you have any substantial communication other than just basic information, try not to send it via text or email, right? Because we've all had that experience of reading an email a certain way and inferring certain things from it in terms of tone and whatever. And so I tend to use too many smiley faces in my emails, right, and text. And it's my way of trying to say to the person, like, don't, whatever, that I'm writing this with a pleasant tone, because it's lacking all of that. And as you say, if we're just not used to how do our facial expressions, our nonverbals, all of that stuff, communicate things, and we're just not used to that like we used to be, and the pandemic's made it even worse. So I am not even a telephone speaker, because I feel like I'm missing out on all the nonverbal communication stuff, right? I'd rather it either be via Zoom or in person, because to me, that's all important stuff. But what I hear everyone saying too is that, well, it may not be useful necessarily if folks aren't good at modulating their own nonverbals and being able to have civil discourse and, that kind of thing. Anything else? That takes us into the whole issue about partisanship and people maybe more than ever feeling like there's a right and there's a wrong and there's no gray in between. And anyway, that's a whole nother topic. Well, let's turn the tables and flip it around for a moment and say, what about when people make negative judgments about us? In other words, how can we increase the likelihood of meeting other people's needs, right? So they're not here for this workshop. They're not here to consider these things. And so they're probably not going to be any better at this than they were yesterday. And so when we hear other people make negative judgments or get angry with us or frustrated, it's very easy to, to get defensive. But instead, if we can swallow that and say, oh, maybe this is a great example where their needs are not being met, so they had a negative emotion, they're projecting it onto me. So when we receive that negative message, can we instead engage in empathic or investigative listening? In other words, trying to step out of the subjective experience and say, okay, I'm going to play detective and try to really understand, like, what is the unmet need underlying their reaction to me right now? Boy, that's a black belt move in my estimation, right? Because you really have to set aside that ego and that feeling attacked and so forth. So what do you think? Do you think that's even possible? Have you ever tried such a thing?
I tried this once.
Once, and I'll never do it again.
No, I tried it once and it didn't go well as it usually did with other people. And I just was like, and I didn't expect it not to go well. I thought, oh, this is going to go well. It did not go well. So I now handle that person a little bit differently because of that. It's like, okay, well, this method might not work for this person. It might be a new method that I have to use for this person.
So I'm just inferring that even though you tried to just understand what this person's experience was, it felt like the more you did that, the more they just unloaded on you in terms of making negative judgments and names and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which is not obviously, like, say, the purpose or helpful, right? We're trying to help that person be a little more vulnerable in the sense of getting at uncovering what was the unmet expectation or unmet need. Absolutely.
Yeah. So then my end result was, well, let's give you some time. I'll let you process everything and then we'll revisit this later.
Need
when
to
you're ready.
disengage. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. Yeah. Other folks, does this even sound reasonable? Or how would you even go about it? Well, let's take an example. So what if somebody came to you and said, you seem to underestimate my abilities? I mean, here's a typical response. That's not true. I've never had an issue with your work. So I can see this being very like realistic.
This is Joanne.
Oh, go ahead, Joanne. Joanne? We lost you.
What I was times.
Oh,
Oh, can you hear me now?
yeah, we can. Yeah.
Sorry.
Uh-oh, it sounds like you might have an unstable connection because it does that like noise. It stretches out your voice. Yeah, we can't hear you. I'm sorry, Joanne. So while we wait for Joanne's connection maybe to stabilize, notice that you seem to underestimate my abilities. Oh, go ahead. No, unfortunately. I'm sorry. Is everyone else having the same issue? Yeah, nod. Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
Sorry, Joanne, we can't hear you. But notice that the natural reaction here is to try to say, why that's not true. That experience, that person's experience isn't true. How could we maybe play investigator instead?
A lot of times, if it is like a situation where, okay. All right, just go on then.
No, you finally we can hear you after all of that. We can. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Try again, Joanne. I think we can now.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, I'm out of the woods here.
Okay, sorry.
Bryn Mawr Avenue, you don't know what that is, but Bryn Mawr Avenue, it's all trees. But anyway, what I was going to say earlier was, I know I used to own a couple of childcare centers, and I would, a lot of times have to deal with a lot of angry parents and that sort of thing. And I always felt that if I started off with, I'm really sorry that you feel that way. What can I do to make this situation better? Then to not be so defensive or whatever, like that seemed to work for me. And I've actually done that with personal situations too. Like, I'm really sorry that you feel that way about me, but let's figure this out.
I like it. And I like this second part of that, which is not, like say after the apology in the sense of like, well, I'm sorry to hear that, is the idea of like, well, what do you want, right? Or how could I fix this? Now, you're not saying that you will be able to, or that you will agree, but I think that is a way to get at the need, right? Because then if the person says, well, you need to do such and such. Well, even though we know that that's not my need, it's really them saying their need. But by saying, well, I want you to do X, or you need to do X, then that does sort of get at the need, right? Absolutely. I hadn't thought about that yet. But again, it takes some, I think, lowering our ego to recognize that just because I'm asking that doesn't mean that I agree with them or that I'm going to be able to honor that request. So what might be an investigative approach to somebody saying, well, you seem to underestimate my abilities? And you say,
I think in that case, it sounds, is my connection okay?
Yeah.
Everyone can hear me?
Yeah. Now we're all concerned about it. Right?
I would say I had some issues earlier on my end just listening, so I just wanted to make sure. But I think this question, it feels very loaded to me. So if someone came to that question, asked that exact question or statement, I guess, to me, immediately I would ask them questions. What do you mean? Or can you clarify that? What do you believe that your abilities are, and what do you perceive I think your abilities are, and try to get to the bottom of it, because that seems really emotionally charged, that statement. So
Absolutely.
I would try to handle the conversation with care on my end. I would try to not take offense to it, because I think Naisha was saying earlier, that when someone comes with an emotionally charged statement, then that triggers you to be emotionally charged, and then it just leads to like hurt feelings or more miscommunication. So I think questions can just disarm everything to get to the bottom of what really is the issue.
Absolutely. So like I say, just to simply say, how really help me understand, how did you come to that conclusion, right? Versus, as you say, whenever we try to get defensive, it's just like throwing gas on the fire, right? So, and I sort of read this as, oh, that's not true. But what if you read it like, well, that's not true. I've never had an issue with your work, right? And I'm raising my voice and getting defensive. And then that person's going to, you know, and now becomes tit for tat in terms of trying to prove to the other person that, you know, that I'm correct. So absolutely. I think anything that simply says, help me understand, what do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? You know, and I like the idea of like, oh, I'm sorry you feel that way. Help me understand. That's not, you know, my experience, or, you know, that kind of thing. Absolutely. Seems so simple,
Maybe
right?
also asking for a specific example can help too.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
I was just
absolutely.
saying, sometimes,
A specific
sometimes
example.
I think, yes, I think usually that comes from something like an interaction. So if you can say, where did you start noticing this feeling? When did it crop up? Was it after I said something or did something? And then you could see like what the trigger was.
I agree. I think many times just by opening the door and saying, you know, well, help me understand, or what, you know, what do you mean by that? Well, the other day when I did such and such, right, and they immediately go, like, say, to a specific example, because, like, say, in their mind, there are lots of examples, or one big one, or whatever. So it's not probably going to be difficult for them to latch on to that, because to them that is the proof, that is the whatever around their which their story is built, right? So absolutely. So where we sort of put a bow on this needs-based part of it, right? So if communication is ultimately about meeting needs, then trying to uncover for ourselves what is the actual need. What does the unmet need, what unmet need does it? Oh, so if we're having a negative feeling, right, or a judgment about somebody, trying to use that as a signal, like, okay, wait a minute, I must have an unmet need. What must be the need? And sort of work backwards, right? And then once we figure that out, try to be as clear and behavioral as possible with our request. And then flipping it around, remembering, turning the tables, that when we are on the receiving end of a negative message or judgment, to try to focus on playing the investigator, do that empathic listening, rather than, you know, jumping to conclusions. So questions, comments about any of that before we maybe talk a little bit more about difficult conversations, and, you know, difficult feedback, critical feedback, some of that kind of thing. Nice. So when we talk about giving feedback or receiving critical feedback, what are your concerns? What have been some of your experiences? So this is one form of, right, conscious communication.
I think mostly when people come with attitude.
I'm sorry, we get some feedback on your end, so I'm sorry, we couldn't hear quite what you're saying.
I guess when people come with attitude. Please tell when people come with attitude.
People come with attitudes.
Yeah, people come with attitude.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm saying. Okay, you want me to say for
Okay, Maureen and I are in the same office.
Oh, okay.
But what she just said, yeah, that's why there's so much feedback.
Oh, okay.
And we both agree, when somebody comes in the office with attitude, we talk very softly, try to calm them down, ask them, you know, what are you feeling? What can we do together to solve this problem? Okay, but we're very calm when we do it. We can't get into what react as they are. Let me put it that way. Yes, we have to stay very calm, and that's the way we handle it. Eventually, you know, you do get them to calm down.
Yeah. No, I love it. Like I say, that's a great skill, right? To be able to recognize they're at a certain level, they're not able to modulate their emotions. I'm going to have to be that person to like ground them and center them and calm them down with my voice and my tone and my slowness of questions. Absolutely. to bring that person down, especially if I'm thinking, I'm making the assumption that we get better at that with age. Many of us.
Oh, absolutely.
So many times
I can speak for me.
exactly. With college students, right? Especially their emotions may run high. And so we may have to help, modulate that a little bit. Absolutely.
While we're on this subject, and I don't know if you're the person that can help us with this, we have students who are running on such high anxiety. Now, I'm a very calm person, okay? But the anxiety is inhibiting their learning. And it's like a contagious disease in the class, okay? So, in fact, I was going to talk to Dr. Rice and Vito. I think we, at least I know I do as a faculty member, and I'm one of the nurses, okay? I need more expertise in helping to diffuse these situations because it's like it's getting out of control. I did hear on the news the other morning, they were saying how our children are now filled with anxiety. So if it's starting early on, by the time I get them, I don't know what else to do for them.
Well, and unfortunately, so like I say, that's a whole big topic, but from the psychology perspective, right. It's cognitive behavioral kinds of intervention, right? So sometimes, I do a session on like modulating or regulating our own emotions and moods, and there's lots of little strategies and things, but the core is really about being able to talk back to some of these assumptions that are part of our story, right? So just an exercise sometimes to say, what could I say to myself? What kind of story could I create if my goal was to create as much anxiety as I could, right? And we say, well, I wouldn't want to do that. I know it's just a hypothetical exercise. Okay, well, I guess I could imagine that if I fail this course, or I'm going to fail this course, and if I fail this course, this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and the next thing you know, you're destitute out on the street with all these student loans and whatever, right? So that's how, in theory, why we are so anxious, because of all these assumptions and stories we tell ourselves, and we're not even conscious of them because they're just sort of spinning back there. So if we want to rein that in, we need to really examine what those stories and assumptions are and talk back to them, be more rational, those kinds of things. And then I'm a big believer in like mindfulness practice. And that's, to me, not meditation. I've never, done some formal meditation, but there is the idea about if I can stay present and focused on just one thing at a time, then I'm not spinning all those stories in the background and, freaking myself out and so forth. So I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but that's where, we could spend an hour, unpacking all of that kind of stuff as well. But, and I'll send, there's just some great self-help resources around that cognitive work. And they've been around forever, right, in terms of classic books and things. So I'll be sure to send some of those resources after our session today as well to look at.
Thank you.
Sure.
So
Go ahead.
I'm sorry for cutting you off. This is like really interesting to me. Yeah. So what do you do with, because there's people that are like empaths, so they take on they just really like same thing Ms. Dolores said, they're like empaths. Like I see like a majority of our students are empaths, and just people in general, you're finding out that more people are empaths. Is there any certain technique you need to use for that?
Yeah. And nothing comes to mind, but what I hear you say is even before the term empath, there's been lots of research that emotions are contagious, right? It's hard not to take on the emotions of other people when we're around them, right? So that's part of the problem, is that if I'm around other anxious people and I'm anxious and whatever, I'm gonna, it just sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So like I know with some of the medical students here, they recognize that, listen, right before an exam, I can't be around other students because their anxiety about the exam just gets me, self-doubt and so forth. So I think just recognizing that if that's true for myself, then I need to protect my own mental health and be able to show up for people in the way I want to by, regulating that in some way, because that is I am empathic. And so therefore, blah, blah. So I think just, self-awareness, right? I guess that for me, everything comes back to self-awareness, and then that can lead to choices around how to, grow and modify and so forth. But it just dawned on me too, part of the resources I'll send, there are 2 free apps. They're both use artificial intelligence to engage the user in a conversation when they're feeling anxious, depressed, whatever the case might be. And in the, it uses these cognitive interventions. And they claim that because you log in as you, that it gets better over time at recognizing your patterns and your irrational thoughts and the things that you get freaked out about, so that it actually gets more efficient. And it gets like these two apps get like 4.7 stars out of 5 at the app stores, and they're free, and tens of thousands of users and so forth. So for college students especially, that might be a good, if we can get them to buy into trying it, way to talk themselves off the ledge when they're really feeling anxious or depressed or whatever.
That's the same thing. I think what you were just saying, I just wanted to add on to that. That's exactly how my experience has been. Having to take, to qualify as a dentist in different countries, so I had to go through all of these set of exams. And I remember when when I got married and I joined my husband in UK, and we were giving these exams, they had actually suspended them. And then there was this, we didn't have all of the sophisticacy as we have now. So we had a common Google Mail where everyone posts their feedback in there. All the feedback, 90% was all about negative, just negative feedback, and more so creating a biased opinion. So most of the students do that. They create a biased opinion because someone said, it is a very tough course, so they push on their experience, and then obviously the new student who's coming in is going to carry on that experience. Absolutely. So this is my experience where I learned, and I was told, you take that experience to say what you shouldn't be doing, in terms of what they had laid out as their experience, and then see how you could work your way out through those experiences. So because their experience is not going to be your experience.
Exactly.
You got to.
Yeah. And what you're referring to is, in psychology, they call it the anchoring effect, that we as humans are hungry for information, right? To build our understanding of the world. And so we latch on to that first bit of information. Oh my gosh, I heard this course is really hard. And now we don't even recognize that it becomes self-fulfilling prophecy, because confirmation bias kicks in, and I start to notice and look for, evidence that this is a tough course. And so that's why I've tried to really be careful now about not helping a new person in the organization or in the department by giving them, you haven't met Dr. So-and-so yet. Well, let me just tell you, when you do, so I might be my intention might be good, because I'm like, I want to give you a leg up. But now I've just tainted the well, right? I've just sort of given you this negative impression, and everybody needs to have their own experience with each person, right? And so,
absolutely. Because at first, the set of exams, this was an absolutely new one. They had to revamp the whole thing, and only a couple of our colleagues here already know that 12% people passed. And then that's where I'm like, 12% people, what happened to that 88%? And I was just worried about that 88%. How am I going to pass these exams? And I think my husband was like, you got to think about that 12%, not that 88%. Think about how that 12% passed. That just changed my entire perspective. So like, if that person can do it, one can do it, then
it shows it's possible. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I know, and just in the interest of time, since we only have a few more minutes left.
They carry someone else's experience, and then.
Sure. Yeah. And in the interest of time, I've only having a few minutes left. Just wanted to present a couple of models, and again, you'll have these slides about having a difficult conversation. So this model comes from this book, 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership. He calls it the clearing model, and I've heard him speak, and he would say it's not just because we're clearing the air between us, but I'm just trying to be clear or transparent in terms of the stories in my head, right? So that we can, work on it or talk on it. So he would say this is the model for having a difficult conversation, making sure it's a good time and setting, right? So if I drop by my colleague's office and I say, hey, I want to have a talk with you, is this an okay time? If I pick up the sense that it's not, like the person, I guess so, but they barely turn away from their computer, right? That's not a good, right? We want to have some time, and we want to have the person's full attention, right? So we assume that we set up that time and it works. Now I want to start with saying, explaining why I'm asking for this conversation. So let's have a positive intention. So I might say, something happened the other day that's really been bothering me, and it's really, changed the way that I see you, or it's changed the way I think of our relationship, and that bothers me. I want us to have a good relationship, right? So I'm at least setting a good intention. Like, this isn't to blame you, this isn't to, you know, castigate you. It's because I want things to be better than they are. Then let's start with the facts and try to describe them as objectively as possible, as captured by a video, because many times we remember different facts or interpreted them differently than the other person did, right? So if I say, hey, well, remember the other day at that meeting when you said such and I said such and such? Well, if I share that and they say, wait a minute, that's not quite what I recall saying, right? Well, then obviously we need to start there because we're remembering two different things. But once we do agree upon the situation or the facts, then, and I don't need to use the word story, I could say, well, you know, my interpretation or, you know, my perception of what you were saying or whatever. But we're trying to share, again, the I statements, my perception. And then because of that, I felt blah, 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 right? So we're getting at the feelings. And ideally getting then at, so what I'd like, or, you know, what I would need from you in the future is X, Y, or Z. Now, the reason I said possibly is because with my experience with this model, usually just going through the first 5 steps leads to a resolution. We never even need to be explicit about how the person, you know, we would like them to act. Because usually if we explain this person, my experience has been, they'll say, oh, I'm sorry, no, that wasn't what I meant. Or, you know, or they might say, well, yeah, I was actually a little perturbed, but, you know, but now we can talk about it, as opposed to, again, just harboring those stories. So could you foresee using this model or some version of it? Again, it doesn't have to be lockstep. But we're sharing our stories with the other person.
I think it works as long as the other person's willing to do the same thing.
Well,
I think that's huge.
Yeah. So people often imagine like, oh, the worst case scenario. They picture like, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to be vulnerable, and the other person's just going to glare at me and cross their arms and whatever. And I can tell you, this is the model that was promoted in the health system where I came from. And so lots and lots of examples of different people, and I've used it, and I've yet to hear about a truly negative experience. Now, that said, there were times that I was asked to be a mediator for one of these conversations, right? Because it was really highly charged and there was a history. And so you needed a third person there to make sure each side is going to listen to the other and not interrupt and whatever. So so I agree that if it feels like it's going to be that contentious, then maybe having somebody there to help, you know, mediate. And of course, in those cases, both people agreed, you know, to the meeting. It wasn't like an ambush or anything. It was, you know, recognition that there's got to be a better way, that nobody likes the conflict or whatever. And I've often said, now this is really a black belt move, but I often said, what if the other person didn't really, like, they just listened and nodded and said, okay, thank you, and then went back to their work. We could even ratchet up a little bit and say, basically the whole thing again, but say, you know, I'm feeling right now, I don't know, I'm feeling sad because I was hopeful that, you know, this would result in blah, 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 right? So I'm sharing my feelings and sharing my story, even about how they reacted. Now that's, you know, really being vulnerable, but. Well, the other model or book that I referenced earlier was this one about difficult conversations. So it's one of my favorite. But to boil it down, because it's an entire book, of course, it's a lot about preparing by processing our emotions and emotional reactions before having the conversation, right? So we need to work through our own stories and our own reactions before we sit down to do that. Then they focus on, you know, avoiding blame. They use the word contributions because they would say, well, everyone has some contribution to the scenario. And even if I feel like the other person's 100% to blame, I could probably even claim my contribution as, well, I'm sorry that I waited this long to address it. Or, you know, I created stories and didn't check them out with you right away. So again, we want to, you know, claim that first. And then staying curious, investigating, trying to be the objective investigator or reporter, you know, doing our good listening skills, our good empathic listening skills, and reflecting and summarize. And then another premise of the book is that many times, especially in the work context, people think, well, we shouldn't address emotions. This should just be about the facts because we're in a work setting. But their point is that these conflicts or difficult conversations are difficult because of the emotions. And if we don't address them, we're not going to get at the heart of it. We're going to come to some agreement on the surface that doesn't really get at you know, the underlying issues and so forth. So I will stop there. That's pretty much the summary. I know we're 1 minute over time, and I'm fine, but I know other people are, maybe needing to jump off, and that's fine. But otherwise, I'm fine staying on if other folks, reactions, comments, questions. There's so much
Michael,
more.
you're going to send all that stuff to me then? So
Yeah. So I'll send you the slide.
Okay.
I'll send you the slide set as well as some additional resources around the cognitive anxiety stuff. Yeah.
Perfect.
Can I just ask a question?
Shoot.
So would you think the communication could be effective based on how you're interacting with the other person in the sense of maintaining an eye contact at the same level as you are sitting, and the other person is sitting at the same level as opposed to you sitting and they're standing, and vice versa?
That's a good point. So you're right. There are lots of things I take for granted in the sense of, indeed, I would think we should both be sitting down. We should both be sitting at the same level. Ideally, there's nothing between us in terms of like a desk and those kinds of things. And so you're right. I take that stuff for granted, but I think all of that is important. So if, for instance, I stop by my colleague's office to have one of these conversations and they're sitting at their desk, but I remain standing in the doorway, that just doesn't feel, that doesn't feel right. So I want to come into the office, or I want to meet in the break room, or I want to go for a coffee, or I want to walk around campus together. It's something where it's, and even when I sit at my office, I'm always very careful about putting the desk against the wall so that it never comes between me and whoever I'm talking with. And then people have remarked that, if I'm working at the computer and somebody comes in to have a conversation, I push my rolling chair away from the desk and spin it around because I want to be able to face, head on and give you my full attention and so forth. Absolutely.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I'll let everybody go, but I just had a question to ask.
Sure.
Because I have a family member that has a mental illness, and can you still use those techniques with people that have mental illness?
Sure, I would think so, right? And again, like I say, everything. So when you say mental illness, again, people are people, right? So again, if we just get back to our humanity, and people want to be heard, and people make judgments, and we have our stories, and so again, I think that's what I heard from some other folks, right, about being sort of quasi-therapists. In terms of talking slowly and whatever, or playing the investigator. And I'm sorry, I don't remember the person's name earlier, who said, students come in and it's like, I use lots of I statements and, really trying to understand. So again, these are just good human, I guess it was maybe Ashley who said that, that, these are just good human interaction skills, right? Social skills that, as we said, maybe have become withered over time. But this is all the stuff they teach you your very first semester in a graduate program in counseling or clinical psychology is, the empathic listening and a lot of therapy. So they call it non-specific factors. In other words, the majority of what seems to account for success in counseling has nothing to do with the theoretical perspective you take or the advice or the models. It's being caring and listening and doing the active listening, reflections, and so forth, right? So for the most part, that is the root of therapy, or being therapeutic for others, is being that sounding board, that person who tries to understand rather than explain or project. And absolutely. Anything else?
Well, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Dr.
Sure.
Wiederman, for these wonderful workshops. Really,
Sure.
really have enjoyed.
Thank you.
And yeah, if you could send that information, I'll send it out to everybody. And I will be sending a survey to everybody as well for just some feedback on the whole series, which I think would be great. And then I'll share that with you, Michael.
I was going to say, I really thrive on feedback. So please, you have been a beneficiary of other people's feedback in the past. So pay it forward, as they say. I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks.
Great. Well, again, thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll be in touch.
Thanks. Bye-bye, guys.
Thank
All right.
you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye.